Okay, it is 9 o'clock. Good morning. For those who've joined in the last couple minutes, we've had a couple on here eager to get started and learn. A warm welcome from Nashville, Tennessee, Music City, from Vanderbilt. We welcome you to one of our first webinars we'll be offering you in a series of webinars to help you lead your organization. Introduce myself. We'll get started here in a couple minutes as folks log on. We have about almost 100 of you right now. That number will rise. But a welcome from me. My name is Dave Goodrich. I'm the Director of Custom Programs here at Vanderbilt Executive Education. For those of you just learning about Vanderbilt Executive Education for the first time, we're the portion of the business school that delivers the same great programming that our MBAs and executive MBAs and other master degree programs get. So for individuals, for business owners, for business leaders, for a high potential population, we're the part of the business school that brings that programming to you in two ways. On campus, which we've obviously suspended for the time being, but will resume shortly as we progress through the phases here. Online, we have about 60 hours of online content that we're currently growing, and a blended component. So there could be half online and half in person. That's the way we deliver. For those clients, thank you for your business. We're happy to have you back here with this exciting content today. A little bit about our programs we typically offer on campus. We have programs such as executive leadership, leading change, negotiation. If you want to be a better communicator or a persuasive and influential speaker, we've got the programming for you. At the conclusion of this webinar this morning, we'll post some names and email addresses for those people within the organization. We'll wait a couple more minutes now. We're just at about 9:02. Those attendees are coming in. We're a little over 125 right now. So again, welcome. I see a couple of questions already in the Q&A. We'll get to those. Again, Dave Goodrich, I'll serve as your moderator today. And as we go through the content, I'd like it to be as interactive as possible. When questions come up, I may stop Dan. We do have a great, we've run this program a couple times for ourselves, and we've got some great content. So it is 9:03 or a little after 9:02. So let's get started. I'd like to frame this webinar for you today. It actually came out of a partnership with the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. We were planning to follow up the leadership study mission trip to San Diego in April, which obviously got postponed, to provide some deep content on workforce planning for those participants in that program. The suspension or postponement of this trip allowed us to actually put together this program and make it available to not only those on the leadership study mission trip, but those in the greater Nashville area. And again, like I mentioned, for those of you who are not in Nashville, we welcome you. So I'd like to turn it over briefly to Ralph Schultz, the president and CEO of the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. Ralph is at home today, as you could see. Pleasant, you might hear some birds in the background, but Ralph, it's all yours.
Well, thanks, Dave. And hello, everyone, and welcome to today's program. I'm Ralph Schultz. I'm the CEO of the Nashville Area Chamber, as Dave said. And while many businesses are adjusting to the new normal, many are also planning for the next normal and adjusting operations in response to COVID-19. This webinar series has been created to help the business community plan for reopening and restoration. And we're really thrilled to be able to partner with Vanderbilt Executive Education. You know, a lot of times we hear about joining webinars and going to meetings to find out best practices. Well, at Vanderbilt Executive Education, it's kind of where best practice is born. So we are really pleased to be able to bring this expert guidance to you. But today's webinar is about redesigning your workforce for the next normal, and with changing customer preferences, it's time for many companies to think about the talent they need to succeed now and in the future. I know we're even thinking that way at the Chamber as we're looking at this coming evolution of business. Along with great content providers like Vanderbilt Executive Education, the Chamber is going to continue to be your partner in the next normal as circumstances evolve. And we know that those circumstances are going to continue to evolve for the next year to 2 years. So Dave, I'm going to turn it back over to you to get us started. Thanks to everybody for joining. And Dave, thanks for the partnership. We love bringing this expertise
You're welcome, Ralph. And I think you just lost connectivity, so that was good timing. Thank you for that introduction, Ralph. I appreciate that. For those of you just joining, we've had about 50 join in the last couple minutes. My name is Dave Girdage with Vanderbilt Executive Education. I'm your moderator for today, and I'm pleased to introduce Adjunct Professor Dan George. A little bit about Dan. Thank you, Dan. He's a double door. That's commonplace for, he's been to Vanderbilt undergrad, he's got an engineering degree. He also has his business degree from the Owen Graduate School of Management. Dan's a recognized strategic workforce planning professional with about 15 years of experience. He's worked at Accenture. He's worked with GE Capital at Bridgestone Americas. He's now has his own organization called Piper Key. I believe that comes from his love for small aircraft. But we've asked him to be a faculty member of Vanderbilt Exec Ed because of his experience in business. So he has that degree, MBA degree, that practical experience, but he's seen what companies have done. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dan. And before I turn it over, keep those questions coming in the poll in the Q&A and chat section, and we'll get started. So Dan, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Really appreciate everyone being here. And obviously, thank you to Ralph and to Dave for getting this set up. All right. So today's agenda, as we've all kind of talked about, what are some of the techniques for redesigning the workforce that you need? First, we're going to talk about why workforce planning. I think everyone's kind of thinking about how we continue their business profitably, and we'll talk a little bit about how workforce planning can help. Second, we'll talk about workforce strategy. Everyone's familiar with business strategy, but how does workforce strategy, how does it do more than just a simple succession plan? Then we'll actually get into an exercise, a capability versus capacity exercise, and this is helping you assess some of the talent gaps you have. This is something that you'll be able to take away with you today. And then last, we'll be talking about how to fill those talent gaps. So there's a method that we've used in the past that many of you are probably familiar with. It's called build, buy, or borrow. So without further ado, we'll get right into it. And again, please use the chat function and question and answer to post anything. First, workforce poll. Is the size and skill set of your current workforce capable of executing the business's future needs?
So great, you should see the polling has been launched. This is Dave talking to you. And as these votes come in, keep the Q&A coming. We've already got 4 questions in Q&A. And it's kind of like watching a game show. We've got about half of you responding right now. So we'll give it about 15 more seconds, about 120 of 202, about 60%. Looks like it's trending towards the mostly capable. We'll give it about 10 more seconds until we get a good statistically significant number, and then we'll go. Okay, we've got about 150 of 203, about 73%, and it's stopping. So I'm going to end the poll and then share the results with those of you here. Briefly, the highest ranked, or the most percentage, 45% by a long shot, mostly capable, but need to adjust slightly. So back to you, Dan. What's your take on this?
Great. Definitely kind of where I would have expected this to be. Really good to see that there's only a small percentage down there not capable. And then, kind of a normal distribution there in the middle. Totally understand this. I would expect this to, very few kind of companies to have this or expectation that their current workforce will definitely fit future needs, just because as businesses continue to innovate, obviously COVID, with everything else, the workforce always needs to continually to grow, to upskill, reskill its resources. And that's kind of what we're going to hear talk about today. So as we kind of get started with this next result, we'll talk about a little bit how the factors that are affecting the phased openings and how do you continue business continuity. Let's pull up this foolish bullet point here. So many of you are probably familiar with some of the McKinsey articles or other research firm articles out there. There's 3 or 4 different phases. I chosen these three, which is crisis, adapting, and normalizing. I think most of us can understand that the crisis phase of COVID is probably almost over, at least for the US anyway, and that we're moving maybe toward more of an adapting phase with the economy opening back up, states starting to kind of see commerce come back. This is where we'll probably exist for the time being. And as we begin to see how this plays out, obviously looking at infections and curve consciousness, will then switch into normalizing phase. With this is probably a couple weeks, if not a couple months down the road, as people begin to kind of understand where this where these factors exist. And this is important because this is really a way to adjust or look at adjusting your workforce and how you can be sure that you're matching the customer demand with what's out there. Because as you look at these different phases, the question that I think most business owners and operators are looking for is, what is my mix of resources, right? I have my fixed set of resources, but as things change, as customer demand changes, how do I change the variable resources in order to meet that demand? And the tough part, I think, which many of you are probably experiencing, is how just to adjust that workforce, right? We're still kind of confused on what the customer demand will be. Many of the past tools that we've used, whether it's month over month or year over year, some sort of seasonal expectation just doesn't meet the goals or the understanding as to how the current customer demand is working. But as we do start to figure out how that works, one of the biggest things that most companies are starting to think about is what happens with the variable resources and even sometimes the fixed resources if a resurgence happens. How does this customer demand change throughout the timing of the phases? Now, as you look at continuing to operations, one of the things that many companies are changing, right, is their operating model. So in the past, typical operations for retail stores is customers flow in wide open and people look at products and select products and check out as normal. Well, obviously that's changed quite a bit. Some of it might go back to quote unquote normal, but a lot of things are definitely changing, right? How do you accommodate both customers and employees to keep them safe, keep them distance, but also operate your business effectively? And then how does the operating model change for your company as we move through these different phases? Obviously, crisis and adapting are slightly different, but what does that next normal look like? How do you plan for a workforce? How do you plan for an operating model that meets that? And then finally, the factors here for opening is looking at social behaviors, right? Everyone's curve conscious. We understand that we can't overflood the healthcare systems. We have to continually seek to understand what the risk tolerances are of all of our stakeholders, right? Our customers, our employees, our communities, right? And how are those customer tolerances changing again over time with each phase? These aren't simple questions to answer right off the top of your head, but these are things that will affect how you run your business, how you understand what customer demands are out there, and how to kind of meet those needs of the community and the social behaviors. And what most of the research and kind of leading medical individuals are saying is, focus on what you control, right? You control your operating model. You can control how your business is conducted and how conscious you are about the social behaviors. And you can certainly control what your workforce looks like. And make sure as you do so, you look to effectively communicate with your stakeholders. And again, stakeholders are more than just your investors and your customers. It's your employees, your community, and throughout. So. All right, now that we've kind of understood a little bit about what the factors are for opening, let's talk about why someone would want to use strategic workforce planning. What is the actual value of it? And the simple definition is having the right talent in the right place at the right time for the right cost. And the overall objective simply is just to improve the performance of the organization, right? We're just upgrading, upskilling its talent so that it can meet the demands of the customer market. But you're probably starting to ask yourself, okay, great. How does that still add value though? So I'm a visual person and I'll take you through this little graph that I think helps depict where we're looking to move. So if you can imagine here, we have a timeline from now till year 1, 2, and 3, and then the desired level of talent on the y-axis, right? And in order to get that desired level of talent, it certainly costs money. Upgrading or upskilling, innovating costs money for any type of resource, and humans included, right? Now the cloud on the kind of top right there, that's all the corporate strategy scenarios, right? So they obviously change over time, but as we head toward that direction, most innovating businesses are continually trying to figure out how they innovate, create those competitive advantages that give them an edge on the market. Now let's understand, if we simply remain or keep the same talent that we have, right? If we lose someone or someone transfers out, or even gets promoted, and we backfill those same people with the same skill sets that were there before, we're simply going to just keep on that x-axis. And the difference here is that if you're the black arrow and you're kind of moving toward your goal, right? Now you've invested a little bit of money there, but if you were not investing any money and you stayed on that x-axis, the next year, between year 1 and year 2, you're going to have to invest a lot more in order to get or meet that direction. And that's where strategic workforce planning helps, right? This helps you develop a range of talent improvement that you can see over time, so that you're not having to scramble to get the talent that you need in order to meet the expectations of the business, the strategy, or the demand.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
I got a question on this. So we're in COVID right now. Is what we're looking at sort of normal, like the normal pace of business, or is COVID changing that arrow on a different trajectory? Does that make sense? Or
Absolutely.
How is this sort of a standard business operating model? But what do you see? Is something ramping up now in different environment we're in?
Yes, great question. And so, yes, this is probably typically a model that we use for normal operating times, and certainly in crisis mode or crisis phase, right, where businesses should be very cautious about what they're spending. This is, one of those places that it probably doesn't apply. But as soon as we move into adapting phase, and definitely in normalizing phase, organizations need to really think about where their investment's going. How are you changing your operating model to meet that customer demand, and how does your workforce need to change in order to effectively get there?
Okay, I just drew in a blue line. I don't know if we're on the cusp of that ramp going up. I also got an interesting chat from Thomas Svitek, mentioning how interesting it'd be to have a network diagram on this. Anyway, thanks for that, Tom. Appreciate it.
Certainly will. All right, poll number 2 here. How well does your organization align its resources or its workforce to the critical areas of the business?
All right, the poll's been launched. Thanks, everyone. We got about 75% participate last time. And again, I got about 6 Q&As coming in there, so thank you for popping in your questions into Q&A. We'll handle that a little after 9:30. Yes to your question. Will the presentation be sent to you at the conclusion of our time together? Yes, if you've registered. We'll send you a copy of the recording to share with your colleagues. We're about a little over half, 62%, Dan, coming in. Interesting breakdown of what we see here. I'm going to get to that roughly 65% number, 66. All right, 68, 69, 70. Same place we were last time. So here are the results. Dan looks like well aligned. It leads 57%, but a significant number of 20% somewhat aligned. So your comments here.
Yeah, great. Certainly, again, great to see that many organizations are well aligned. I think this is one of the areas where a lot of companies know what the critical areas of their business, and aligning the majority of the resources to those areas is pretty simple to get right. But what's the real advantage of strategic workforce planning is being able to optimize your workforces, knowing what actual skill sets can you really tweak to really produce a better output and a better effect on the business. Very good to see, though, a couple very well aligned, and again, not well aligned, only a few. So that's great to hear. All right. So now that we've kind of understood a little bit about workforce planning, some of the things that value that it can bring, I want to talk about linking business and workforce strategies together. I have to assume everyone on this call has in some shape or form, been involved in the business strategy, which leads to an annual budget and finally leads to a headcount plan. Very typical, fiscal responsibility of every organization. And one of the interesting things about this is in this process, right? The budget is created, a headcount is solidified, and let's say you're a leader of an organization and you've got 50 or so people that you have right now. The business has agreed we're going to look at growing a little bit, and you have 3 extra headcount for next year. Now, where do you hire that headcount? How does that really align with the business strategy? Is that as many as you need? Is it too many? Does it work? It's these types of questions that kind of create an alignment challenge with the business strategy and the headcount plan. When you blanket over how many resources are needed across the space, it sometimes doesn't really get to the point of what's happening. This is where workforce strategy comes into play. It's that fourth kind of quadrant that connects the headcount plan to the business strategy. And what this is, it's a specific written out plan, and it has a list of priorities and actions that the organization can take. And the whole intent of this is to make sure that the workforce can execute on that business strategy. And of course, we don't have enough time to go into detail of what one of those plans will look like, but again, looks like a very systematic strategy for how you look at replacing and upskilling, reskilling those resources that you have.
Dan, I got a thanks for that. Keep that slide up if you don't mind. Jason Cockerell, thank you for your comment. His comment was back to the poll. Well aligned prior to COVID, realignment occurring daily or weekly as we create new revenue streams to offset revenue loss. Successful realignment at such a rapid pace is the challenge without disrupting traditional roles. Great comment there, Jason. Dan, any comment with that? I know we have an exercise later about the pace, but any comment around his creating new revenue streams?
Absolutely agree. I mean, that's, business continuity is kind of priority one for a lot of organizations right now as we move from crisis mode into adapting. And again, most businesses are just trying to figure out how to kind of stay alive and keep the cash they need to operate. And that is definitely priority one. But as many companies are starting to kind of move into that second phase, that's where the shift of, okay, do we have enough cash, but how do we start operating? How do we start getting the workforce that we need to execute in this, very different time period? Great.
Thanks, Dan.
Absolutely. So now that we have a workforce strategy, we have a business strategy. Some of you are asking probably some of the harder logistics is, okay, how do we actually link this strategy to workforce plan? And so there are many roles in this thing. It's not any one person's responsibility. This is definitely the responsibility of many stakeholders across the business. But we'll talk about 2 here. And the first is the leader's role, right? It's their job really to run the business, understand what the industry is like, what's changing in the industry, and how that affects that workforce, right? So we have, what are the major trends? What are the competitors doing? Both the mature competitors as well as the upstart competitors. And how these competitors and mature organizations, what those trends and how that impacts the body of work that exists right now, right? Then your role, assuming you're either an HR or the professional that will be helping with this exercise or program, is to help the leaders segment that talent into meaningful sections in order to achieve the strategy and the execution that's needed, right? So there's the leaders that understand the business and how it's run, and then you're helping them kind of pocket all that together, package that all together, and deliver that strategy. On this next piece, I can probably understand at this point, many of you are saying, okay, great. I've done this before. This seems very familiar. Kind of feels a little bit like succession planning, right? So we've got roles that we need to fill because these are critical. And sure, succession planning is usually specific roles that are critical. For different organizations, it could be a list of names of the high priority roles, and then a list of individuals that says they're ready now, ready in 1 or 2 years, ready in 3 or 4 years, depending on how deep that goes. And for many organizations, this could be 10, 25, 50, 100, depending on the size of the organization, but it's usually specific roles. Whereas workforce planning or strategic workforce planning, and for this case, it's more or less both the same, is it focuses on talent segments, right? This is a large portion or significant portion of the workforce. And what this does is these talent segments are the common skill sets across. So if you're looking to go more digital in certain aspect of your business, Are you looking to upgrade your analytics or some of the systems? What kind of IT support do you need for that? If you're looking to change sales areas, what kind of sales workforce do you need? What kind of customer experience? So these are the larger talent segments or common skill sets that go along with that. And the final point I'll make on this aspect is strategic workforce planning is definitely a process. And I put that in big, bold letters because a lot of people think it might just be a project. We do it for a year or two and we're good. Well, most of the big companies have these have had them for many, many years over time. And again, the whole point is to adapt the workforce, right? To execute the business strategy. Because if you can upgrade and reskill your workforce, that talent can provide that desired competitive advantage to keep your business innovating and on top of the run.
Dan, in your experience with some of the GE Capital and Accenture and Bridgestone, some large organizations, and your role, what have you seen in your professional life? Can you, out of 10, there's 10 organizations, how many do succession planning and how many do strategic workforce planning? Or better said, how many of that 10 actually do strategic workforce planning?
Yeah, great question. To be honest, it's usually about 1, maybe 2 out of 10 that have long-standing, sustained workforce planning initiatives and programs.
Okay, interesting. Do you see a shift given this crisis to move more towards strategic workforce, or is it?
I've certainly seen quite a bit of interest in it over the last 1 or 2 months. So as people, even more so within the last probably 5 weeks, as people started to kind of come back, started to really think about their workforce and how COVID's going to impact it long term. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. To our third poll. So is your organization able to identify where the gaps are in your workforce? So you were aligning your workforce before. Now we want to be able to identify where those gaps are.
Okay, great. Thanks. The poll's been launched. Terrific. We've got 7 questions in Q&A. Keep them coming. Interestingly, I had a question come up in chat from Marlon Scott. If you've received government funds for payroll, how should you allocate those funds over the next quarter? Can you comment on that while we finish up the poll?
Great. Yeah, this is probably a question for multiple stakeholders, I would say. So involving your accountant is one, and probably some sort of legal advice is another. Obviously, the rules and regulations and policies on this can be difficult as they're not all ironed out yet. But for sure, government assisted funding on this kind of stuff, I think, is really focused on how do you sustain the workforce that you've had, and that doesn't mean that you can't look to upgrade or upskill some of those resources while using that money during this phase. But certainly, I would reference those other resources in terms of what the business can actually do. Okay.
Thanks, Dan, for that. Thanks for that chat there. So we have same number, about 70%. We're going to end polling, and similar to the previous poll, most talent gaps are identified, but also a similar, some talent gaps are known at 22%. So can you comment on that spread, if you will, Dan?
Sure. So looks like, yeah, that's great to see that most of the gaps are identified. Again, also great to see that the bottom there is only filled up by a few. The funny thing is, a lot of places, this is not an easy task, right? Identifying talent gaps systematically is quite difficult. And in case you're or unless you're doing this on a regular basis, or there is some sort of cadence to this, it's difficult to kind of sustain knowing where those talent gaps are. I think unless you're part of that aspect and your business leaders or stakeholders knows how to raise his or her hand, then it's difficult to look at this over a mass part. But that's also where this next exercise, I think, is really helpful to conduct, and one that I think you'll all find pretty useful here.
This is my favorite exercise here. I've gone through this, so look forward to it.
All right, but before we kind of hop into it, first want to look at how do we assess talent gaps, right? And the simple definition, right, is the talent that we have versus the talent that we need. And when we look at the two different types of gaps here, we'll look at the capacity gap, right? This is the difference in the numbers and the impact. And for this one, we'll look at full-time equivalents or FTEs there. And this can be created by an expansion or in many cases that we've seen a contraction, right? So a gap can be both positive and, and negative here. Gaps can also be created by resignations or retirements, internal transfers, reorganizations, certainly by location changes, and then obviously by automation, right? Artificial intelligence, machine learning has created capacity gaps as well. The other side is a capability gap, right? This is the difference in the skill level, right? And we talk about the skills needed for new technology or innovation or other aspects of the business, whether it's learning a new software or operating differently. How do you look at those capability gaps, right? And that's typically changes in technology or products, a customer grouping or a market, right? Large changes in strategy, right? We're going to buy different, look at mergers and acquisitions, buy a different part of the industry, buy another parallel or another vertical. Ways of working, work 9 to 5, you work on a computer or you work in a manufacturing site. How do those change, right? And then finally, automation definitely always affects capability gaps as well. So now we'll actually get into looking at how to use a method of capability versus capacity to identify those gaps and fill it. So right now we're gonna, and if you want to, you can draw it on a piece of paper and use this for later, but we've got a fictional story here about a grocery store chain. And I've selected 3 different talent segments. And we're going to go through and kind of talk about how we would rank their capacity and capability gaps with a high, medium, or low. When I say high, medium, or low, it's the size of the gap. So low gap, medium gap, and high gap. So first is the cashier clerk, right? And for capacity, I think I've come up with these already on my own, just anecdotally with my knowledge of this. I'm just making some assumptions. So for capacity gap, a lot of companies I've talked to are looking at needing more cashiers or clerks just because with a insurge of COVID, they have certain individuals that are checking them out and there's certain precautions that have happened. But if there happen to be in a particular grocery store region or store a outbreak, that they need more cashiers and clerks to help essentially run the business, right? So if you had 25 cashiers that were running the store beforehand, in this case, you might need 45 or even 50, because this could, again, help to make sure that you don't have any lapses in service. Now, capability gap is probably low. It's not super difficult to train up new cashiers, not very difficult to find them. So we'll have a capability as low. For a supply chain analyst, now we have a capacity gap of high. And the scenario that I'm thinking of is many of the grocery store chains are experiencing an issue with supply chain. They can't get the products that they need to stock the shelves. So hiring more supply chain analysts to help them go and find the products that they need to stock the shelves would be a good way to help that. And as we probably can assess, supply chain analyst is not a low capability, but maybe not a high capability. You could look at either upskilling or training other individuals within the organization to do this role, or you could look to hire someone from the outside or even hire kind of contract labor. The next on here is the regional store manager. Their capacity is low, right? They don't really have a gap. You can't hire a ton of additional regional or store managers. However, the capability is medium. As these individuals start to experience very different scenarios with how to work with employees during a pandemic, how to essentially communicate some of the issues that they're having in the store, whether it's supply chain or within a community. These are types of skills that, the operating model is changing, and these store managers and regional managers need to know how to adapt to that, in which case it creates a capability gap.
Hey, Dan, I like the model you used, grocery store chain. A lot of people recognize the grocery store since most people use grocery stores. Oh, Richard Taylor, the front cover of Business Week this week features the explosive growth of Instacart. So well said, the business strategy is changing and the way food is getting to the consumers has changed. So thanks for that comment. Question, So we ahead of time, we figured out what these critical talent segments, we chose the grocery store chain. But if I'm at X company here in Nashville or wherever our clients are, how would you go about picking these three? Is it important which areas you focus on, or can you just provide some insight for our listeners?
Oh, again, great question. So talent segmenting is definitely part art and part science, and it holistically deals with understanding the context of the business and how your business operates. And this is kind of where the multiple stakeholders piece comes in. So you'll need leaders, both functional and operational side, as well as HR, to help you kind of decide what those critical talent segments are. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to really dive into how you do that today, but happy to kind of answer questions and discuss a little later. Okay. All right. So now that we know a little bit about what the gaps are, let's talk about how we interpret that and begin to assess what we do with these gaps. So I've already kind of plotted these on here for us. And what we'll see here is first talking about the capacity gap, right? So we have, in this case, either a medium or a high capacity gap. And when you have these capacity gaps, you're needing to increase the output or the number of individuals that you have. And some of the ways you can do this is recruiting new, retaining existing, so retaining more. That also means it's reducing turnover, right? You can look to increase productivity, change some of the org structure, or even kind of start to look at shifting both leadership and culture. How do you kind of use these levers in order to increase or decrease the gap of the capacity? Now, on the other side, you have the capability gap, right? So this is where the capability is either a medium or a high, and you see the regional store manager is down there. And for this, you're looking at increasing the skill set or performance of these individuals. So training, development, assessment, replacing or upgrading, reskilling, upskilling. These are the areas that we look for here.
Yeah, thanks to Dan. As you transition to the next slide, we got a chat from Thomas. Change culture, that is important. You're absolutely right. Culture is culture eats strategy for lunch. That's been around for ages.
Yep.
We have programs at Vanderbilt Exec Ed on leading change and creating a culture that will that enables things like what Dan's talking about. But thanks for that comment, Thomas. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great. All right, so now that we've interpreted, although rather quickly, where the gaps are, let's talk about how we fill those gaps, right? And so what are the talent needs of the organization? And in this scenario, we'll kind of talk about it for the next 90 days. So in this sense, the first option, right, is to build, right? And that's develop talent internally, whether that's learning, development, training, whatever it is to kind of get those resources to the next step. The second is to buy. In this case, simply means hire external talent, right? Most part, buying is like you're going out to the market, finding someone that already has that skill set and hiring them into the organization. The third aspect here is borrow. So contracting, part-time labor, seasonal labor, consultants, contractors, whatever it is you need that can temporarily help your situation and fill those gaps. Now, with any of these, there's trade-offs to consider. First is timing. How fast is the talent needed? Obviously, it takes a little bit longer to develop internal talent for the most part than it is to either hire externally, so buy or borrow. For the most part, probably borrowing is the fastest, but it can also be the most costly. So in order to make sure that you sustain proper margins within your organization business, you have to consider what the costs are. Now, borrowing resources is expensive, but if it's only for a short time, then typically it's the smart move. And obviously the length of time is a big part of this, right? So if it's a temporary need, then certainly just look to probably borrow or even kind of buy that external talent. And temporary could mean 3 months, 2 years. But if it's something that you really need, that the organization is going to continually grow in that aspect, you probably want to look at building those capabilities. Many organizations, for instance, will hire college students or some part of the organization, and they have big, large training institutions where they kind of train their workforce to do what's needed, because that's the area that can continually grow their business over time. They know that that's going to be something that they need, and it's difficult to find that inexpensively in the market. All right. So to recap everything we talked about today, so again, thank you for being here. And to wrap up on the techniques, the first part is, again, why workforce planning? Focus here is if you don't start investing in the resources now, you're going to either A, fall behind in innovation, or be unable to meet the kind of corporate strategy scenarios that you're looking to do. And you certainly want to invest now over than having to invest a lot more later. The second is workforce strategy. It links up with business strategy. How do you figure out what budget and headcount plan is available? It's more than just succession planning. Third is, how do you assess talent gaps, right? Everyone can anecdotally see where there are talent gaps, but how do you systematically, programmatically look at finding those talent gaps and assessing what talent you need in order so that you can fill those talent gaps using, again, the build, buy, or borrow method. And as of now, that concludes our presentation.
Great, Dan. Thanks. Really great stuff. We've actually got a list of about eight questions submitted to us earlier today. And we actually had one question I'm going to start with Candace Young. She got this to me yesterday at 2 o'clock. What will hiring look like between now and the next 6 months for companies that are restructuring their workforce plan?
That is a great question. I wish I had a perfect answer for you. What I've seen so far is that the companies that are faring better than others are definitely looking to hire or even really upgrade their workforce. So I've seen more and more kind of come out. There are certain businesses that will kind of need to sustain a restructuring period. But if you're, a job seeker out there right now, really concentrate on those industries that aren't as impacted by COVID. But certainly as the economy start to open, as we see, the economy without any type of resurgence, I think we're going to see a return a lot faster than we have in years past.
Awesome, thanks. If you don't mind bumping to the next slide, that'd be great. Just so we have it, people know to pump in questions. I meant to say this. What we've talked about today, it's been a lot of content in a short amount of time. A reminder for those who weren't at the beginning of our call, we do have programs like this. This program today on workforce planning is we're sharing a little bit of Dan's content with you to get a flavor for interest. Following this program, we will be sending out a quick poll to you guys who are interested in doing a more formal, lengthy, where there's a lengthy class or program where you can take either online or here on campus, which you see that photograph. We are interested in seeing if there is a demand for this programming. It could be 1 day, it could be 2 days, it could be 3 days, it could be online. But we do want to hear your thoughts and feedback about this program today. If you want to do more of it and do more of the exercises in class or remotely, that would help inform us. And in front of you, you see Kate's name, my name, and Paula's name. Kate puts together programs like this. You can see at the website at the top, we have programs throughout the year, either online or in person, and feel free to reach out. So that was a quick PSA. Back to the questions. The next one that came in was, what technology do you need to track and model the data?
Excellent question. I know as many of you probably look to either start or figure out how to begin one of these programs. The best and easiest way is literally with Excel. I've started this at so many companies with Excel. There are certainly many great vendors out there that sell workforce planning technology. And again, if you want to know more on those vendors, I can certainly point you in the right direction at a later date, but those can be expensive and oftentimes tough to build a business case to get those technologies before starting a program. But like I said, good old Excel, we've all probably used it here. It's an excellent way to start with a simplified model to begin looking at how you can optimize your workforce with workforce planning.
Terrific. A next question is from actually a fellow colleague of ours, Professor. Can you offer examples, best practices of what Peter Cappellini, a well-regarded HR thought leader, a few years ago called talent on demand?
Yeah, so Peter's obviously, one of the highly respected individuals in this space. And, you know, the talent on demand aspect is really key for a lot of organizations, right? As you look to understand what are the talent needs, and having those kind of variable talent needs set up ahead of time. So whether it's contractors, consultants, seasonal workers, knowing how to have those talent on demand, what those talent segments are, is a very key aspect to, again, optimizing the part of the business model that's here. I know many companies are just trying to survive right now, which, you know, it's certainly a different question to answer. But the talent on demand aspect, you know, especially as most companies run what's many call a lean atmosphere, is really advantageous to when you do see either spikes or changes in customer demand.
Awesome. This, as we see the unemployment go up, both here in Middle Tennessee and nationally, this question is actually for a job seeker. So someone who's who's working for one of these organizations. The question is from Catherine. For a job seeker, what skills would you recommend us to highlight to be the ideal candidate for an organization trying to survive reopening?
Well, yeah, obviously, I think characteristically, it's you're really looking for individuals that I believe have kind of risk tolerances, you know, depending on what type of business or industry it is. If they're working from home, obviously a lot lower risk, but if they're, you know, within the economy, within, you know, the kind of social distancing aspect of individuals, you're looking for people that probably have a slightly higher risk tolerance for kind of wanting to be back out in the world. Tough to say without knowing much more about the industry or business, but you know, certainly aspects of that could help.
Yeah, this next question is from Anthony. I've heard this question before from our clients. Who do you see as the owner of the workforce planning strategy, HR or business? Great question, Anthony.
Oh, this is an awesome question. And one I wish we had kind of time to address a little longer, but the short answer is both HR and the business. But I believe wholeheartedly in the fact that it truly should holistically fall under the business to own, because they are the people that have to sponsor the time and the resources to put forward, because HR cannot do this alone. You really need the business in the meetings, supporting the documentation, knowing what the documentation said, being part of the strategy about how the talent is developed or trained, you know, build, buy, or bought. And if the business isn't there, if they're not in full support, that's where you start to see cracks in the foundation of these programs. And that's ultimately where some of the, you know, the programs tend to fail over time.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Question from Tony. I'm currently working in a decentralized company with business units that operate very different from one another. Is there a process or method you'd recommend to getting the conversation started around strategic workforce planning? So Tony may be those nine out of 10 companies that maybe do succession planning, but he wants to move the needle. So appreciate that energy. But Tony's question, what process or method you recommend to get the conversation started around strategic workforce planning?
Absolutely. Easily one of the things that you can start with is finding a talent gap. So a part of the organization that's really kind of hurting, you know, somewhere where both either even capability or capacity, either one of those aspects is high or has a large gap. So you don't have enough people, or you're really missing out on a skill set to effectively meet your strategic goals. And again, that, let's say that's in business analytics, right? You really want to be able to refine the supply chain or certain aspects of the operation, but you just don't have the resources to it. You might have all the IT support you need, but you just don't have a business operator or many of them to be able to do so. In which case, now you'd be able to create a hypothesis and a story based on the gap that you see. Conduct one of these exercises with, you know, talent segments that make sense, and then kind of build your business case from that. I believe, was it the third or fourth slide there that talks about, you know, investing where you want to go and the case for that. And there's certainly some numbers behind you build the business case, which I'd love to talk about next, but certainly don't have enough time today. But there's definitely some harder numbers you can put behind a business case for how much money to invest in that.
Okay, thanks for that. Question from Colin. This is the long view of strategic workforce planning. What does the first phase of maturity look like? Part one. And two, what does 3 to 5 years look like for the talent space in general?
Yeah, so great question. Starting off is always probably one of the hardest, and even regarding the last question, right, is finding that first use case for upgrading talent. So whatever talent segment that is, whatever hypothesis and kind of business need that you have, starting with that is the best place, because garnering support for this is typically not easy, as business leaders have many aspects and priorities that they have to attend to. And unless that business case is well thought through and you can convince those stakeholders and the leaders of having that, that's the first aspect. Because going from a culture without workforce planning to a culture with workforce planning can take years. But doing so, it's the old adage, right? You got to take one step forward in order to do so, and that would be finding that talent segment and hypothesis. To answer the second part of the question, is what does it look like in 5 years? Man, if I knew, I would. I'd be on an island somewhere on a beach, right? It's tough to say where it's going now. Many people are definitely looking toward the fact that as companies are innovating faster, we're really going to have to look at some of the softer skills, as well as kind of the programming stuff. How do you service your clients better? As we've switched more from manufacturing to service oriented businesses, how do you create those experiences for customers that they want to have, and what kind of brings them back? So I would, if you're really thinking about this, I think most people are kind of trending toward service and experience oriented skill sets, and understanding those aspects to how that interlocks with the business.
Great. This question's from Kathleen. She's got 2 questions. Kathleen, thanks for your patience. I know you asked this early on. So 2 questions she asked. I'm a big fan of the second. So the first question is thoughts about job redesign, since many have not been working or have been working from home. The second question, more holistically, thoughts about recreating team cohesion. So let's do that question. Thoughts about recreating team cohesion.
Sure. Yes. So many aspects of what I would call this as a capability gap is teams that used to be able to meet in person. Obviously, there are many different dynamics to meeting in person, right? You can see everyone's face and emotion, and people are actually present. You can humans feel different emotions when they're in the same room. It makes it much more difficult when they're apart. It's tougher to build relationships. It's tougher to garner support, or even kind of get those nuanced feedbacks from people. So, as we look to what I would call a different way of working, right? This is where you really kind of focus on what skill sets can you use to change that. And there are, at this point, thousands of webinars on how to kind of help teams build more cohesion during a distancing era. I don't have all the answers to that, so to speak, right now, but that's definitely something that working with the talent management groups and other aspects of the business to really discover on your specific business environment, how can you kind of build that cohesion, would be a capability gap that I would certainly look into.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. We've got a couple more. We've got 10 more minutes and try to get to all these questions.
Sure.
Since we've made, you guys have put it in here. Anthony, again, where can we get benchmark around strategic workforce planning in order to measure its efficiency in a consistent manner, similar to what already exists for financial metrics? So balance sheet, statement of cash flows, income statement, those are pretty discrete, uniform, and recognized. Is there something it's in your world, our world, strategic workforce planning, that can compare and benchmark to others?
I love this question. This is a great one too. And it's one that I always try to answer for business leaders, especially those that run P&Ls or profit and loss segments, because that's how they run their business. That's how they run their metrics. They understand the levers that they can pull in order to change those numbers. Strategic workforce planning, in many aspects, can be similar. It takes a decent amount of effort, but as with everything that's an animate object, right, a human, there are many complicated aspects, scenarios, aspirations, inspirations that change very quickly, and sometimes without, no, I mean, it's the quantum calculating aspect of, human behavior and psychology. So the short answer is, if you're looking to do workforce planning and kind of benchmark those metrics, a lot of it comes down to creating consistent program measures that talk about the cost of either training, building, buying. How do you staff? How do you innovate your workforce to get where you need to go, and track those costs year over year? And that can be quite complicated because you're looking at all the costs and expenditures that go into that. So really having general ledgers that can be as granular as, where did you spend money on hiring new talent through talent acquisition, or retained services, to as far as how much did it cost to train this talent segment group throughout the year? What, did you spend $10,000, $20,000, per worker on this over the year? So that granularity comes from that. And a lot of companies aren't there yet, but some are getting a lot closer in these last couple of years. But you're very right in the fact that this can be a difficult endeavor to take on, because it does take so many resources to get there. But the ones that do get there, again, are the same companies you kind of see at the top every year. They've got a very systematic and programmatic way of getting the talent that they need.
Thank you, Dan. Question from Sam. Sam held, I've heard we have moved from fighting for talent to having talent surplus. Is that true? My guess is yes right now, but Dan wants to know, which sectors is it more true or less true?
Again, difficult question to answer kind of without kind of more specificity, but the rhetoric around talent, whether it's a war, a fight, a struggle, I think those kind of tend to be hyperbolic news headlines. But certainly there's always a competitiveness in finding the best talent, and when you're doing so, it really helps to know what talent aspects are running the business. And I think that's where workforce planning, you're looking at the skill sets that you need to fill the gaps in your business. And again, that you really have to know what context the business is fighting. And again, if you're pick something, what's the easiest thing? Construction development company right now, right? And you're trying to find construction workers that, or concrete workers, or some new aspect of it, glass and building, how do you find those workers? How do you get those individuals into the organization? That's understanding what those talent segments are. That probably wasn't the perfect example, but holistically though, focusing on what will give your company and organization the competitive advantage, finding those common skill sets and then hiring for those is the objective.
Terrific. One last question, because we're coming up on the top of the hour here. Last question, and as a reminder for those who have asked, we will be sending out a recording to those who registered. The question is, what is the key skill resource we need to access or develop for the new normal? Example, remote technology skills, small group resource development, etc. And then secondly, share specific workforce changes by business sector. And he's written event, concert management, manufacturing, retail, hospitality, lodging. I think let's tackle that first question first. What is the key skill resource we need to access or develop for the new normal?
Sure. Obviously, I think that is very different for what industry you're in, but I'll kind of give two examples. Almost everyone on here would probably agree that in the next normal, at least for the next normal while, right, being able to work remotely and understanding all the aspects of, conducting projects and programs and executing operations for companies that, can be remote is a big one. If you're a business that operates, kind of within the public, within the medium, then you're really focusing on how do you change your operations to make both customers and employees feel comfortable. And those skill sets can be focused on, customer experience individuals, right? So if you're, again, back in the grocery store chain, right? If you have people walking around like they used to, stocking the floor, running the cashier, you're now trying to train those individuals to be empathetic, be cautious of how how customers like to shop. You know, are they distancing themselves? Are they wearing their masks? Are they being helpful, you know, in this kind of time of weird social change? And that skill set is not something that everyone understands right off the bat, right? You have to either develop or train individuals to really look for that kind of emotional intelligence in people. If you see someone kind of skittish, like, what do you do? Can we help you? Those kind of things. So those aspects of what you're looking for is probably what I would think can help.
Okay, great. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for those who've joined. We had about 213 join us. This will be sent to you for those who registered as a recording. As a reminder, we will be sending out an email to you asking for some feedback. At Vanderbilt, we try to work as closely as we can with our clients, both individual and company. So please inform us of what you thought was great today for our next webinar series. July 23rd, mark your calendar, June 23rd, mark your calendar for a program on technology forecasting, how to predict the future. If you were on this email list, you will likely get an invitation to that. It's, again, June 23rd, 10 a.m., how to predict the future. So we can adapt to this next normal that Dan mentioned today. If you want to reach out to any of us, please see those emails you see up on the screen. Again, Dan, great presentation today. And for those of you who joined, for those of you who joined, thanks for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you the next time. Thanks so much.